Hey everyone, I just wanted to go over your autoethnography essay. So here we are with the PowerPoint that I gave you guys. The first thing you want to do, if you haven't already started, is to conduct your research. Research in autoethnographies is personal. It's things that you're doing or acting out. So if you're going to look at your space and then do a another sort of place identity uh, study, kind of like the moving assignment that we read, but not necessarily with the moving aspect, right? Just looking at how your space is organized, what you have on the walls, how you organize your space. Then you're going to take pictures of that. If you're doing it based off of affinities, or if you wanted to do it based off of your own digital identity, which is a thing you can do, the identity you present yourself out as in the world, you could be pulling images off of your Instagram account and pulling stories off of your TikTok or off of your Snapchat. And these are the ways in which you can have that research. The goal here is that it's something that you're doing already. If those things don't sound fun to you, you could do journaling, right? Where you're like, okay, well, every night, my family sits down and has dinner. Imagine journaling after four or five of those dinners and doing an ethnographic analysis of family dinner. These are all options, right? Interviews with friends and family, that would work for more historical essays. Things like if you're a member of a faith group and you want to do a analysis of how that faith group sort of represents you, you could do it with the leadership of that faith group, people within that faith group that you have. If you're doing it from an affinity space, like you play games with the same group of friends every week, you could interview those friends. So these are the ways in which you could do research for this assignment. And it's all based off of you. Remember that the aspect of this is that you're always negotiating globalization. So we can talk about that. For example, I'm a member of a gaming group that used to play Dungeons and Dragons. But Dungeons and Dragons is sort of an interesting thing to look at from a globalization standpoint because the capitalism of their choices is really not playing well to a lot of the members of the community, right? The need for more and more players all the time rather than taking care of the players that are already there is sort of this globalization and a global affinity space aspect where Hasbro, the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons, is really hoping to sell more product. And in order to do that, they're changing the game in certain ways. So we could actually do that as a gaming group, like from a globalization standpoint, I could have interviewed my friends that I play games with. Once you've done that, what you want to do is look at all the data you've sort of compiled. Don't go into this with an idea. Look at the things, right? Talk to people, do some introspection, do some real meaningful reflection about your space. If you have K-pop stars up and posters on your wall, like there's the easy analysis of being like, I like them, but then there's the bigger analysis of like, what does that mean from a globalization, Orientalism, cultural hybridity standpoint, where we can start to do that, right? So don't just be like, I like this, so it's on my wall. Go deeper into some of the aspects we're talking about here in our class and about how these tensions of power and money and other aspects of globalization are pushing and pulling on these cultural icons that we then consume and sort of represent us. And so from here, that's what you're doing is you're trying to come up with a thesis that does that. You could use any number of things. I've gone to mind maps. There's tons of videos about how mind mapping works on the internet. It's a very useful research tool or understanding tool if you're going to go into really dense STEM fields. A lot of really accomplished STEM leaders talk about mind maps as a cognitive tool to help you understand very complex things. You could free write. You could just start writing until you get to that place. You could do graphic modeling, where you go through this and you're like, okay, thesis, and then build a sort of outline visually for what your insights do. This is all up to you, like how you want to do this. That's the idea, right? The goal here is to find the common thread. We don't want 3 to 5 body paragraphs that are like, I have these things on my walls and I do these things. It's more about like how all of those things interplay to prove something. So if we go to your rubric here, we can start to see like the introduction provides the background to your study. What does that mean? Well, here's the reading we did in class, and we can start to see that within her study, we start immediately, right? That she's going to do a visual autoethnography, right? And that what she hopes to understand is this moving process. That's her intro, right? That doesn't tell us what she found yet. That's just her starting by defining some of her terms. This is a visual autoethnography. I'm looking at this thing called moving. She starts to define what she means by moving, right? And gives context to that analysis. So this is a good intro, right? Like this is what we're getting to. But the big deal for me is the thesis, which really starts down here. Something I want to make very clear. Your thesis should only be one simple sentence. Her thesis is much longer because this is a 20-page paper. The longer the paper gets, the more available room you have for a thesis. You guys are only writing, 1,000 to 1,500 words. Just be succinct and simple. Make one claim, right? And so here we can start to see how she's talking about you start to consider the contents of your pantry like you never have, right? Like she's walking through her mind process. But where it really happens for me is down here at the bottom where it says to the ways in which humor and exhaustion are communicated and how we care for our things. Like she's talking about how she's going to pack things away. And there's got to be a conversation about is it even worth packing? For those of you who've moved around a lot, you might know this. I just moved to Seattle from Phoenix. And I'm going to tell you, I left a lot of stuff behind, a lot of stuff that I missed. I just couldn't move it. I literally could not move it with me. And so there is a humor and an exhaustion to it in a way that I deeply understand, right? And that's where she starts to define it from wrapping prized possessions, right? But her main point is this sort of last sentence. It's a very long sentence. To focus on the joy material objects can bring and the enormous pain of having to move them all. In closing, I reflect on the emotional toll that moving takes and how, in reconnecting with our things in the process of physically moving them, we come to situate our sense of home in our things and the memories they hold, transporting them from one house to the next. That's her thesis. That's what she's trying to sort of get to, is that home in a contemporary sense is about the things. It's about the arrangements. Some of you may have just moved home into a dorm. Some of you may have moved out of the house and into your own apartments. And if you're, or you might be thinking about it. And so your notion of home may be this really complicated thing about what you take with you and how home is objects. That's a weird conception, and it plays into globalization because those objects could be representative of a cultural hybridity, right? Like you could have objects from other places. You could have objects from your friends, right? And that friendship is home to you. And you're symbolizing that by putting that object in your new home. And so that's the thesis. That's her unit of analysis is how these things represent this concept of home. So that's what you guys are doing. Notice here that I'm pointing that out in the thesis, that that's really what I'm looking for is a very simple, direct thesis statement. And from there, we can start to write our introduction, right? Here, we looked at hers and we're like, she's talking about a visual autoethnography. Well, it's a visual autoethnography of moving. And she talks about the notions of moving and what that means. And so she's defining her terms, but we already understand all three of these things before we get to her thesis, right? We know what her topic is, we know what her scope is, we know what her methods are. And then when she says these things constitute home, whatever that means, we definitely understand her argument. And from here, every analysis point is going to be about how objects mean home and how the movement of them, the care for them is about home. So, this is just meant to show you that your analyses should connect to your thesis. So, as she progresses, every section of her paper, every argument in her paper is trying to make this point about objects and their relationship to home. And that's what you're going to do, right? You're going to look for those kinds of themes in the things that you are doing field work on, right? That's the big upper level thing that we're talking about here is that reflective part where you really have to think very deeply and clearly about what it is you're trying to communicate to your audience about you, about your autoethnography. Notice the transitions there on the side because we want them to move meaningfully. Don't just go in the order you think they should go in. In my one-on-one class, I'm very big about the logic of assignments because that logic is a selling point. It's one of the three rhetorical modes you guys learn about, right? Ethos, pathos, and logos. Well, ethos and pathos are going to be built in here. You're going to be credible because you're going to be talking about yourself and things you do. The emotion should be in the objects and the analysis and the people. But your logic should be as you move to understanding better and better how this analysis is trying to show you something about yourself, about you, about life, about culture and identity, right? Like those bigger things, it should become more and more clear as we move through that assignment. Think meaningfully about what paragraphs go where. If it were me, I'd be answering these questions on something like note cards. And then I just move the note cards around until they made a meaningful order. And if you do that, you can start to see how you can end a paragraph very meaningfully moving to the next paragraph, right? That's the idea here. You shouldn't have subheaders, really. Your paper is not long enough and you don't have different sections. So everything here should be under the thesis. You're not subdividing it any more than you have to. And then you get to a conclusion, and the conclusion is like, what's the takeaways? Here we know her takeaways are going to be about how objects are home. That's where we ended our argument, is like she is going to prove that all of these objects somehow reconstitute home. That when we talk about how we pack them, when we talk about what we keep, we're reconstituting a notion of home. And at the end, she's going to talk about what that means and why that matters. So that's the assignment. Hopefully, this helps you understand. If we go back to the rubric, you can see, right, your body paragraphs again should begin with a claim, right, where you're like, hey, this is a choice I made. For example, in moving, I chose to keep this. How does that mean? How does that make home? Right? Or, hey, I chose to toss this. How does that reconstitute home? For you guys, you could be like, hey, this is an image I chose to put up and maybe even edit, especially if you guys are doing an Instagram analysis, like talking about the editing process of those images and how you go through different variations of that image to try and present, like, what is that all trying to say about you? What does that mean? That's a really interesting and important question. That's where the bulk of the points are going to come from here. Half your grade is these analysis points. Your conclusion, again, just coming back to what's the takeaway? What's the big deal, right? What are you trying? Well, why does it matter that we see things in this way? You're gonna have to do it in APA, which we've talked about. There's an APA style paper in your files, and you can just look it up on Purdue OWL. It should have a title page. That should have a page numbers to the top right hand corner. And that should be in the header. There's no running head. You don't have to have any words in that header, just the page numbers. The title page starts with a bold title, an extra space, and then the header where it's your name, the class, the school, the date, and my name. And then you page break. The second page should have the title at the top, centered like everything else. And from there, it should be left aligned, indent every paragraph, reference page for anything you might be citing. Remember, you should be citing things from class, especially if you talk about multiculturalism or whatever. Um, so if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, hopefully this will help. Otherwise, I hope that you guys enjoyed class and enjoyed this assignment. It's an interesting way to look at things like that.